Disease in modern history.
Authorities are bracing for more rioting tonight.
He's knocked unconscious.
Citywide emergency.
2 years ago, the zombie apocalypse struck my reality. I tried to find a cure in some of my games at the time, but before I could do anything, I was zapped to a prison in space. And unluckily for me, I forgot what the cure was, and I don't even know where to start looking at this point. After the massive hit that was Resident Evil 2 back in 1998, it was no surprise that Capcom would start working on not just a sequel, but some spin-offs to the new survival horror franchise. While these spin-offs were being worked on, the next mainline Resident Evil was starting to be developed. This game would see Hunk, first seen in Resident Evil 2, infiltrating an Umbrella cruise liner in his attempt to get a sample of the G-Virus. While working on this game, the team ran into a huge problem: the PlayStation 2 launch. The team at Capcom didn't have time to finish the current project before the release of the PS2, and they didn't feel like upgrading this new game to the PS2 since it was being developed for the PS1. This meant that the team would just have to scrap this Resident Evil game so they could start work on a Resident Evil game for the PS2. There was another problem: Capcom didn't want fans of the franchise to wait several years for a new mainline release, meaning the RE team would have to think quickly. Thankfully for them, one of those spin-offs would work perfectly for a sequel. Originally, the spin-off was going to be about a random citizen trying to escape the infested Raccoon City, but the RE team decided to change this random citizen out for Jill Valentine, seen in Resident Evil 1. The game would still be about her escaping the city, now needing to survive the horrors all over again, but this time it would be on a much bigger scale. After the game's main elements were worked out, all they needed to do was come up with a name. The team thought about calling it Biohazard 1.9 or 2.5. I don't know what's with the RE team trying to have this weird naming scheme, but thankfully Capcom wanted this game to round out the trilogy, meaning the game would be called Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis would get a playable demo at E3 in 1999, with demos also being shipped out with a copy of Dino Crisis. Resident Evil 3 would launch on September 22nd, 1999, and has a record sale chart of 3.5 million copies sold. But that's not where the story ends. You see, in 2019, Resident Evil 2's remake launched, shaking everyone with an amazing reimagining of its original counterpart. Capcom decided, since they had just given the Resident Evil 1 remake an HD remaster, along with them now developing the Resident Evil 2 remake, they would decide to wrap up this remake trilogy by remaking Resident Evil 3. Resident Evil 3 didn't start at the same time as Resident Evil 2, they did have some overlaps while in development, like with Mr. X. The RE2 team was working on how Mr. X would work in Resident Evil 2. The RE3 team saw this and decided to compare notes while working on Nemesis's behavior in Resident Evil 3. Although they did make some things similar, the team did want Nemesis to be more aggressive than Mr. X's slow stalking demeanor. Resident Evil 3 would be announced on December 10th, 2019 at a PlayStation State of Play, and it would finally launch on March 19th, 2020. Let's get a closer look to see just how this remake held up. No matter if we are talking about the original or the remake, when it comes to the looks of Resident Evil 3, I can say the same thing. It looks like the last game. While Resident Evil 2 had a huge step up from its predecessor, Resident Evil 3 doesn't make any major improvements to its visuals, mainly due to when the game came out. The original Resident Evil 3 came out just 1 year after Resident Evil 2, just at the end of the PS1's lifespan, meaning they couldn't really improve the graphics. While the Resident Evil 3 remake has the same issue, only coming out 1 year after its predecessor, again, not leaving much room for graphical improvement. But since these games look like their counterparts, it means they look just as good. I would actually argue that the original Resident Evil 3 looks slightly better when comparing it to the original Resident Evil 2, since they are still using pre-rendered backgrounds, allowing for new and interesting environments rather than reusing assets from the game engine, like the 3 remake did. Honestly, it can be really hard to define Resident Evil 3 as its own game. If you've ever played Resident Evil 2 before, the game will feel and look very similar. Whenever I bring up Resident Evil 3 to people who have played the RE franchise, they always have a hard time recalling this game, and I think it has to do with the fact that it seems like this game is no more than an add-on to its big brother, Resident Evil 2. Where these similarities differ, however, is in the soundtrack. Both the original and the remake of Resident Evil 3 take on a different approach to the soundtrack. While Resident Evil 2 has a slower tempo in its soundtrack, Resident Evil 3 starts to lean into that 90s action movie music, having more grand scales along with faster pacing, allowing the music to make you feel like you're always on a chase rather than being stalked. That still doesn't affect your save room music, however, since just like in every RE game, this is your safe place, and the game wants you to know that. The soundtrack fits with the theme of the game very well, since little that you know you're always on a timer, meaning you're going to be putting that pedal to the metal as you move into the gameplay. Resident Evil 3 continues the trend of stealing, taking inspiration from its bigger brother. Let's start with the original. The original Resident Evil 3 uses the same control scheme from the first two Resident Evil games. These controls are known as tank controls, and I've already gone into depth on how these controls work in my first two Resident Evil videos, so I'm not going to rehash them here. Resident Evil 3 does bring some new additions to the game. The staple would be the gunpowders. Gunpowder works very similar to herbs, where you can mix two gunpowders to make a specific type of ammo. This addition would stick around for future Resident Evil games to use, like Resident Evil 7 and 8, along with all of the new Resident Evil remakes. Yeah, it was Resident Evil 3 to start the gunpowder trend that would continue for the rest of the series, although one new game mechanic would not go on to be as included. This is the live selection feature. At certain moments in the game, you'll get to make a choice. This choice would allow you to decide on how your playthrough would go, in the sense of what enemies you might be finding in the next room, or if you will have to fight Nemesis. Oh yeah, that's right, let's talk about Nemesis. Nemesis is the big bad for Resident Evil 3. He works very similar to Mr. X from Resident Evil 2. He is the special kind of tyrant from Umbrella sent to kill any living STARS members he can find, hence his iconic catchphrase being STARS. Jill, your main character, is one of these members of STARS, meaning he is going to be a recurring enemy you will have to deal with. If you choose to attempt to kill the Nemesis, you will be rewarded every time you manage to take down this hulking beast. You will be rewarded with a special item for defeating this massive tyrant, making those live selection choices somewhat important. Another feature that isn't used frequently in Resident Evil titles is the dodge mechanic. This dodge mechanic is used to, well, dodge attacks from enemies, making it pretty self-explanatory. Shifting focus onto the remake. Resident Evil 3, the remake, takes almost everything from the original, leaving out the live selection bit, since now you can choose to run away by using your controller. Other than that, all the same game mechanics reappear in this remake with an added focus to your lockpick. Since Jill is the master of unlocking, you can choose to carry around Jill's lockpick to open special boxes, granting you access to special resources. All the enemies make their return from old to new, like the average zombie, but the city has cooked up some new horrors for you to deal with, like the Drained Demos, a bug-like enemy that can infect you with literal stomach bugs that you can only get rid of by using a green herb. The Gravediggers from the original have been reworked in this game to now be Gammas, these weird-looking chicken monsters who secretly are trying to cosplay as the Demogorgon from Stranger Things. Hunters from Resident Evil 1 make their return in this game, while being a fun callback to Jill's time in the Arklay Mountains. Now that we're through the new and old, let's take a quick moment to just talk about the main skeleton of Resident Evil 3. Just like the games before it, Resident Evil 3 is a survival horror game where you will need to keep track of your resources to stay alive, all while having to solve puzzles to open new pathways throughout this labyrinth of torment. But why is Jill having to relive her every waking nightmare? Let's find out by diving into the story. On September 28th, Raccoon City was hit with an outbreak like no other. The entire city was infested with zombies. They quickly took over the police force and overran the city, leaving everyone out to fend for themselves. Jill Valentine is a STARS member who has already lived through this horror back in the Arklay Mountains in the Spencer Mansion. She wakes up to a call from one of her fellow team members, Brad Vickers, the wussy helicopter pilot from Resident Evil 1. Let's just say, he's no Mike. Brad gives Jill an ominous warning that something is coming and she needs to get out of the city. As Jill goes to grab her things, the wall blasts open, revealing this hulking beast. This leads to a chase where Jill is blasted out of her home and onto the streets of Raccoon City, where she now has to deal with the horrors that lurk around the city. Thankfully, not too long after her recent eviction, she finds some Umbrella soldiers who are trying to evacuate any survivors they can find. The sight of Umbrella makes Jill's gut churn. Umbrella was the pharmaceutical company behind the Arklay Mountains incident. With the team's thinning numbers, Jill agrees to help them just to save the people of Raccoon City. Little does Jill know, this is going to be one hell of a night. While on the story, I do want to point out the interesting direction the remake took with it. My favorite is Jill's beginning dream, showing the player just how much the events of Resident Evil 1 truly affected her, while also using her status as a police officer push her to put her hatred of Umbrella to the side to help out the people of her city, showing just how much she cares about her city since these are the people who are literally tormenting her every night as she tries to sleep, yet she's still working with them. It's just a great theme that works very well with Jill's character. Man, do I have an opinion on this game. But before we make it there, let's touch on the original game. My opinion on Resident Evil 3 is that it's a pretty solid way to close out the original trilogy, with everything that makes the two prior games so great while still giving new additions, even with their limitations. I love how you can see where the team wanted to improve from Resident Evil 2, and this is mainly seen with Nemesis. He takes Mr. X from Resident Evil 2 and makes him faster, more persistent, and even scarier. The original Nemesis clearly gave inspiration for the reworked Mr. X from Resident Evil 2's remake. This game just rounds out the PS1 trilogy, allowing for a new generation of Resident Evil. And I love coming back to these old games, seeing how Resident Evil has just evolved as a franchise to this day. But every good Resident Evil fan knows that evolution hasn't always been good, and that takes me to the remake. It is honestly a very good game and overall pretty fun. My biggest issue with it is that it lacks the dedication the team took to make it a good remake. I'm sorry for comparing this game to the original, but as a remake, it leaves itself open to that criticism. The amount of cut content is just very sad. For anyone who played the original and then played the remake, you probably had the feeling of having a hollow experience, especially since this game goes by fast. On my first blind playthrough, I beat this game in 6 hours. That is like nothing for a $60 game. It also doesn't help that it feels like the devs were trying to fluff up the game by adding in a ridiculous difficulty mode that feels so unfair it makes you feel like you don't even want to play the game. For anyone playing the remake not being subjected to the original, I feel like this is another good game to round out the remake trilogy. It is a quality game. It's not a game like Fallout 76 where you can barely play it because it's broken. No, instead, you barely get to play this game because it feels so short. But not everyone has the time to dump 50 hours into open world games, so short isn't always bad. It's just something to be disclosed to anyone who is thinking about buying this game. However, if you don't like short games and you buy this thinking it's going to be longer, you're gonna be sadly disappointed. That all being said, should you buy Resident Evil 3? Since the original can't be purchased in any retail stores, I can't really say the price for it, but if you find it around 60 bucks and you really think you want to give it a try, while having a survival horror artifact, I would say grab it, since the game can go all the way up to $100 right now. While Resident Evil 3 Remake is not really worth its retail price of $39.99, I would recommend the game if you can grab it on sale for around 20 bucks. It is probably the most reasonable price for this game.
You know, I forgot to mention herbs. That's right, herbs were the cure for the zombie apocalypse. But where am I gonna find any herbs, let alone enough to save the whole world? I'm gonna have to prepare.
Thank you all so much for watching this episode of What Is. As always, if you guys enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. It really helps out the channel, and I'm trying to get to 500 subscribers before the end of this year, which only you guys can help me out with, so it would be heavily appreciated. If you guys want to see more What Is episodes, you can click the playlist that has every What Is episode I've ever made. Other than that, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. You can't see it, but I'm waving y'all goodbye. See you guys.